Do you always let your seatbelt do the driving? Ryan's teasing voice broke the silence in the driveway as he leaned against the passenger door of my car, a crooked grin playing on his lips. I looked up from the driver's seat, where I had been battling a stubborn seatbelt that refused to budge. Very funny, I said dryly, tugging at the strap again. It's stuck. I've been trying to fix it for 10 minutes. Ryan chuckled, his dark eyes sparkling with amusement. Move over, he said, opening the door and motioning for me to scoot back. Let me handle this before you injure yourself. I hesitated, unsure if I wanted him so close. But the seatbelt wasn't going to fix itself, and Ryan had a knack for solving problems with an ease that always managed to make me feel both grateful and mildly annoyed. Fine, I said, sliding back slightly. But be careful, it's... Before I could finish, he ducked into the car, his body leaning over mine as he reached for the seatbelt. The space between us evaporated in an instant. I could feel the heat radiating off him, the faint scent of his cologne, woodsy and clean, wrapping around me. His arm brushed against my shoulder as he worked to free the jammed buckle, and I held my breath, suddenly hyper-aware of every inch of him. There's your problem, he muttered, his voice low as he tugged at the strap. His face was inches from mine, and when he glanced at me, his eyes met mine in a moment that felt far longer than it should have. You okay? He asked, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. I nodded quickly, looking away. Just hurry up. Ryan smirked but didn't say anything, his focus shifting back to the seatbelt. After a few more seconds, he freed it with a triumphant click. There, he said, sitting back slightly but still close enough that I could feel his presence. Good as new. Thanks, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He didn't move right away. Instead, his gaze lingered on me, his expression unreadable but charged with something I couldn't quite name. My heart was racing, and I hated how much I wanted to stay in that moment, how much I wanted to let myself lean into him. But I didn't. Shouldn't we get going? I asked, forcing a lightness into my tone as I glanced at the clock. Ryan blinked, as if snapping out of a trance, and nodded. Yeah, let's go. The car ride was quieter than usual. Ryan usually filled the silence with stories about his day, or playful banter that never failed to make me laugh. But tonight, he seemed distracted, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. I wanted to ask him what was wrong, but I was afraid of what he might say. Afraid of what it might mean. So instead, I stared out the window, pretending not to notice the way his eyes flicked toward me every so often, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. By the time we reached the family gathering, the tension between us had settled into an uneasy truce. Ryan opened my door for me, his hand brushing mine as he helped me out of the car. The touch was brief, but it sent a spark up my arm that I couldn't ignore. Thanks, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his gaze holding mine for a moment longer than necessary. Anytime. As we walked toward the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, something I wasn't ready to face. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the moment in the car over and over again. The way his arm had brushed against mine, the warmth of his body so close to mine, the intensity in his eyes when he looked at me. It was all too much. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into a simple act of kindness. But deep down, I knew better. Something had changed, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop it. Ryan didn't stay away for long. The morning after the family gathering, I was in the middle of tidying up the living room when I heard a knock at the door. My heart jumped, a silly reaction, really. But I couldn't deny the thrill that ran through me when I opened the door to find him standing there, a confident grin on his face. Good morning, he said, holding up a paper bag. Thought you might like some coffee. Good morning, I replied, trying to keep my voice even. You didn't have to do that. He shrugged, stepping inside as if he belonged there. I was driving by anyway. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing, taking the coffee he handed me. I wasn't sure why he'd stopped by so early, or why my chest felt tight with both anticipation and unease. Ryan didn't seem to notice, or maybe he did and chose to ignore it. He settled onto the couch, stretching out like he owned the place, and gestured for me to sit down. So, what's on your agenda today? He asked, his tone casual. Just some cleaning, I replied, sitting down across from him. The usual. You should let me help, he said, leaning forward. I don't need help, I said quickly. Maybe not, he said, his voice softening. But you don't always have to do everything on your own. There was something in his tone, something gentle but firm, that made my chest tighten. I looked away, focusing on the coffee cup in my hands. I'm fine, Ryan, I said quietly. Are you? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question caught me off guard, and when I looked up, his eyes were steady on mine. There was no teasing in his expression, no hint of the playful charm he usually carried. He looked serious, concerned. I'm fine, I repeated, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. The silence between us stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable. Ryan leaned back on the couch, his gaze never leaving mine. You know you can talk to me, right? He said after a moment. I know, I replied, my voice softer now. Good, he said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Because I'm not going anywhere. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that left me momentarily speechless. I nodded, unable to think of anything to say, and sipped my coffee to hide the sudden flush in my cheeks. As the morning turned into afternoon, Ryan stayed. He helped me sort through some old boxes in the attic, joking about the dusty knickknacks we found, and making me laugh more than I had in weeks. At one point, as we both reached for the same box, his hand brushed against mine. It was such a small thing, but the warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me. I glanced at him, and the look in his eyes made my breath catch. Sorry, he said softly, though he didn't pull his hand away immediately. It's okay, I said quickly, stepping back to put some distance between us. But the moment lingered, the air between us charged with something unspoken. Later, as we sat on the porch with glasses of iced tea, Ryan leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the horizon. You know, he said, his voice thoughtful, it's nice being here with you. I glanced at him, surprised by the sudden shift in tone. What do you mean? I don't know, he said with a shrug. I feel like I can be myself when I'm here, like I don't have to pretend to be someone I'm not. His words struck a chord in me, and I felt my chest tighten. That's a good thing, I said softly. Yeah, he said, his gaze shifting to mine. It is. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the silence between us filled with something I couldn't quite name. When Ryan finally left that evening, the house felt quieter than it had in a long time. I stood by the window, watching as his truck disappeared down the driveway, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between us. Something I wasn't sure I was ready for. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but the truth was impossible to ignore. Ryan wasn't just my late husband's son anymore. He was Ryan, kind, charming, and attentive, in a way that made me feel seen, in a way I hadn't felt in years. And no matter how much I tried to deny it, I couldn't ignore the way he made me feel. Alive. The days that followed felt like a slow unraveling. Ryan kept finding reasons to stop by, bringing groceries I didn't ask for, fixing things around the house that didn't really need fixing, and staying just long enough to make my heart race every time he was near. He had a way of filling the silence with easy conversation, his voice a warm and steady presence that made the house feel less empty. But it was the moments between the words, the lingering glances, the way his hand would brush against mine, the way he stood just a little too close, that made it impossible for me to ignore what was happening. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. He was just being kind, attentive, the way he always had been. But deep down, I knew better. One evening, Ryan called me from the driveway. I'm outside, he said, his voice calm but with an edge of something I couldn't quite place. Thought you might want to go for a drive. A drive? I asked, surprised. Yeah, he said. It's a nice night, clear skies, we could head out to the lake. I hesitated, but the idea of sitting alone in the house felt unbearable. Give me 5 minutes, I said, hanging up before I could overthink it. The drive to the lake was quiet at first. The radio played softly in the background, and Ryan's hands gripped the steering wheel, as if he were holding on to something much heavier than the car. When we reached the lake, he pulled off onto a small dirt road that led to a secluded spot by the water. The moon hung low in the sky, its light reflecting off the surface of the lake in shimmering ripples. Ryan turned off the engine and leaned back in his seat, staring out at the water. I used to come here with Dad, he said softly. We'd fish, sit by the fire. It was peaceful. I nodded, my chest tightening at the mention of his father. He loved this place, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. So did you, he said. The weight of his words hung in the air between us, and I felt my breath hitch. I turned away, staring out at the lake, but I could feel his gaze on me, steady and unyielding. After a while, Ryan got out of the truck and walked toward the water. I followed, the cool night air brushing against my skin as I stepped onto the soft grass. He stood with his hands in his pockets, staring out at the lake. I've been thinking a lot lately, he said, his voice quiet but firm. About what? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. About you, he said simply. My heart pounded in my chest, and I looked down, unable to meet his gaze. Ryan? I know what you're going to say, he said, stepping closer. That it's complicated, that it's wrong, but I don't care. I turned to face him, my breath catching at the intensity in his eyes. You should care, I said, my voice trembling. Why? He asked, his voice soft but insistent. Because other people might not understand? Because it doesn't fit into some neat little box? Yes, I said, though the word felt hollow even as I spoke it. Ryan reached for my hand, his touch gentle but firm. Do you feel it too? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I closed my eyes, my chest tightening as I tried to find the strength to deny it, but the truth was impossible to ignore. Yes, I admitted, my voice cracking. The admission hung in the air between us, heavy and electric. Ryan stepped closer, his free hand brushing against my cheek, and I felt my defenses crumble. Then stop fighting it, he said softly. Before I could think better of it, his lips met mine in a kiss that was equal parts tender and urgent. His hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melt into him, the world around us fading into nothingness. For a moment, there was no guilt, no doubt, no fear. Only the warmth of his touch, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against mine, and the overwhelming sense of being alive. When we finally pulled away, I was breathless, my hands gripping his arms as if to steady myself. Ryan rested his forehead against mine, his hand still holding me as if he were afraid to let go. This is crazy, I whispered, my voice trembling. Maybe, he said, his lips brushing against my temple. But it's real. His words sent a shiver through me, and I knew he was right. It was real, terrifyingly, undeniably real. The drive back was quieter than the drive out. Ryan kept his hand on the gear shift, his fingers occasionally brushing against mine. Every time it happened, my heart skipped a beat, but I didn't pull away. When we reached my house, he walked me to the door, his hand resting lightly on my back. Are you okay? He asked softly, his gaze searching mine. I nodded, though my thoughts were anything but calm. I'll see you tomorrow? He smiled, the kind of smile that made my chest ache. You couldn't stop me if you tried. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the way his hands had felt on my skin. The way his voice had sounded when he said my name. The way he had looked at me as if I were the only thing in the world that mattered. It was dangerous. It was wrong. But it was also the most alive I had felt in years. The next evening, Ryan showed up unannounced. I had just finished cleaning up after dinner. The house quiet except for the faint hum of the dishwasher. When I opened the door and saw him standing there, his hair slightly tousled from the wind, I felt that same familiar jolt in my chest. You didn't call, I said softly, stepping aside to let him in. I didn't think I needed to, he replied, his voice calm but with an undertone that sent a shiver through me. He carried a bottle of wine, holding it up with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Thought you might want some company. I hesitated, my fingers tightening on the edge of the door. But the truth was, I didn't want to be alone. Not tonight. I'll grab some glasses, I said, leading him into the kitchen. We sat in the living room, the bottle of wine between us on the coffee table. Ryan poured the first glass for me, his movements slow and deliberate. The way he looked at me as he handed it over made my pulse quicken. What are we toasting to? I asked, my voice unsteady. He leaned back on the couch, his glass in hand, and gave me a small, knowing smile. To honesty, he said simply. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his gaze. Honesty, I repeated, raising my glass. We drank in silence for a while, the soft glow of the lamp casting warm shadows on the walls. I tried to focus on anything but him, the ticking clock, the faint sound of the wind outside, but it was impossible to ignore the tension building between us. "You're quiet tonight," he said, breaking the silence. "I'm just tired," I replied, though we both knew it wasn't true. "Liar," he said softly, his tone teasing but his eyes serious. I looked away, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass. "Ryan?" "Don't," he interrupted gently. "Don't push me away." His words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. I set my glass down, my hands trembling slightly, and when I looked at him, the vulnerability in his expression undid me. "I'm not trying to push you away," I said quietly. "I just don't know what to do with this." "This?" he repeated, leaning forward. "What is this, Linda? Tell me." I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. But the way he looked at me, patient and unyielding, made it impossible to deny what we both already knew. "It's something I can't ignore," I admitted finally. "Then don't," he said simply. Before I could think better of it, he reached across the space between us, his hand covering mine. The warmth of his touch sent a shockwave through me, and I felt my breath hitch as his thumb traced slow circles over my knuckles. "You're allowed to want this," he said softly. "To want me." The raw honesty in his words broke something inside me, and before I could stop myself, I leaned forward, my lips capturing his in a kiss that was hesitant at first but quickly deepened. Ryan didn't hesitate. His hand moved to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and I felt myself give in completely. The world around us faded into nothingness, leaving only the heat of his touch, the softness of his lips, and the overwhelming sense of being alive. Somehow, we ended up in my bedroom. I couldn't remember how we got there, only the way his hands moved over me, with a reverence that made my heart ache. He paused for a moment, his forehead resting against mine as he whispered, "Are you sure?" I nodded, my hands gripping his shirt as if to anchor myself. "Yes," I said, my voice barely audible. What followed was a blur of warmth and connection, every touch and kiss weaving a tapestry of intimacy that left no room for doubt. Ryan was patient, attentive, and the way he looked at me, like I was the only thing in the world, made tears prick at the corners of my eyes. For the first time in years, I felt seen, truly, deeply seen. Afterward, we lay tangled together under the soft glow of the bedside lamp. Ryan's arm was draped over my waist, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice low and soothing. I nodded, my head resting against his chest. "I think so," I said, though my mind was a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't yet name. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said, his lips brushing against my temple. "Just know that I'm here. No matter what." His words brought tears to my eyes, and I closed them tightly, trying to hold on to the moment for as long as I could. But as the first light of dawn crept into the room, reality began to settle over me. The weight of what we had done pressed down on me like a stone, and I couldn't ignore the questions that began to swirl in my mind. When Ryan stirred beside me, his eyes fluttering open, he smiled softly, his hand brushing against my cheek. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning," I replied, though my voice trembled slightly. He seemed to sense my unease, his smile fading as his gaze searched mine. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Later, as I stood by the window watching him drive away, the house felt quieter than it ever had before. I wrapped my arms around myself, the memory of his touch still lingering on my skin. I knew we had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and the weight of that realization was almost suffocating. But beneath the fear and doubt, there was something else. A flicker of hope, fragile but insistent. For the first time in years, I felt like I was standing on the edge of something new, something terrifying, something wonderful. The day after, I couldn't focus. My hands trembled as I folded the laundry, the feel of Ryan's touch still vivid against my skin. Every room in the house seemed to echo with his presence, and my mind replayed every moment from the night before. I had crossed a line I never thought I'd cross. And while a part of me felt alive in a way I hadn't in years, the weight of guilt and uncertainty pressed down on me like a stone. When my phone buzzed on the counter, I jumped, nearly dropping the shirt I was holding. "Ryan, can I see you later?" I stared at the message, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to say no, to give myself time to think, to breathe, but the thought of him, of the way he had looked at me, made it impossible to resist. Me, okay. He arrived that evening, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. I opened the door to find him standing there, his expression calm but serious. "Hi," I said softly, stepping aside to let him in. "Hi," he replied, his voice equally quiet. We stood there for a moment, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. Finally Ryan broke it. "Are you okay?" he asked, his gaze searching mine. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I feel conflicted." "I get that," he said, stepping closer. "But I don't regret it. Not for a second." His honesty made my chest tighten and I looked away, unable to hold his gaze. "Ryan, this is so complicated," I whispered. "Only if we let it be," he said, his voice steady. We sat down on the couch, and Ryan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Talk to me," he said. "Tell me what you're thinking." I hesitated, my hands twisting together in my lap. "I'm scared," I admitted finally. "Of what?" he asked gently. "Of everything," I said, my voice breaking. "Of what people will think, of what this means, of losing you." "You're not gonna lose me," he said firmly, his hand covering mine. "I'm here, Linda. I'm not going anywhere." The certainty in his voice made tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "How can you be so sure?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because I know what I want," he said simply. "And I want you." Before I could respond, Ryan reached out, his fingers brushing against my cheek. The touch was so gentle, so full of tenderness, that it made my breath catch. "You don't have to make any decisions right now," he said softly. "But you don't have to push me away either." His words broke something inside me, and before I could stop myself, I leaned into him, my forehead resting against his. "I don't know how to do this," I whispered. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady. "Together." When his lips met mine, the kiss was slow and deliberate, as if he were trying to reassure me without words. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself give in completely. The world outside faded into nothingness, leaving only the warmth of his touch and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against mine. We moved together like we had the night before, but this time it felt different, more deliberate, more certain. Every kiss, every touch, was a reminder that I wasn't alone, that I didn't have to carry the weight of my doubts by myself. Afterward, we lay tangled together on the couch, the soft glow of the lamp casting warm shadows on the walls. Ryan's arm was draped over my shoulders, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice low and soothing. I nodded, my head resting against his chest. "I think so," I said, though my mind was still a whirlwind of emotions. "You don't have to be scared," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. "We'll take it one step at a time." His words were meant to comfort me, but the weight of what we'd done was impossible to ignore. The days that followed were a mix of quiet moments and unspoken tension. Ryan continued to visit, his presence a constant reassurance. But as comforting as it was to have him near, I couldn't shake the fear that lingered in the back of my mind. What would happen if someone found out? What would people say? One evening, as we sat on the porch, Ryan turned to me, his expression serious. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" I asked, my chest tightening. "About us," he said. "About what this means." I looked away, my fingers twisting together in my lap. "It's not that simple, Ryan," I said softly. "It can be," he said, "if we let it be." His words stayed with me, long after he left that night. I knew he was right, that the only thing standing in our way was my fear. But letting go of that fear felt impossible, like stepping off the edge of a cliff, without knowing if there would be anything to catch me. The next time Ryan came over, he didn't bring groceries or a toolbox. He brought a question. "What do you want, Linda?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Not what you think you're supposed to want. What do you actually want?" The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. I looked at him, my chest tightening as I tried to find the words. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "Then figure it out," he said, his hand covering mine. "Because I'm not going anywhere. And I'll wait as long as it takes." As he left that night, I stood by the window, watching his truck disappear down the driveway. The house felt quieter than ever, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy blanket. I didn't know what I wanted, but I knew I couldn't keep running from the truth. The morning after Ryan's visit, I woke to a quiet house. The sunlight streaming through the curtains felt warmer than usual, but it did little to ease the heaviness in my chest. His question from the night before echoed in my mind. What do you actually want? For years, I had lived my life according to the expectations of others. First as Bill's wife, then as the stepmother who kept the family together after his passing. But in Ryan's gaze, in his words, I saw a challenge to break free from those constraints. The problem was, I didn't know if I had the courage to take the leap. I spent the day busying myself with household chores, trying to avoid the inevitable spiral of doubt and fear that loomed over me. But the memories of the last week kept creeping in. The way Ryan's hands felt when they brushed against mine, the softness in his voice when he reassured me, the way he looked at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I had reached a breaking point. I couldn't live in limbo anymore. I picked up my phone and dialed Ryan's number. He answered after the first ring. Linda? His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of concern. Can you come over? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said without hesitation. True to his word, Ryan arrived quickly. When I opened the door, he stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes searching mine. What's wrong? He asked, his voice steady but gentle. Nothing, I said softly, stepping back to let him in. I needed to see you. Relief washed over his face, and he nodded, his lips curving into a faint smile. I'm here. We moved to the living room, where he sat beside me on the couch, his knee brushing against mine. The closeness felt comforting, grounding, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. I've been thinking about what you said, I began, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan turned to face me fully, his gaze intent. And you're right, I admitted, my throat tightening. I've spent so much time worrying about what other people think about what's right and wrong that I've forgotten to ask myself what I actually want. His hand found mine, his fingers lacing through mine in a gesture so simple, yet so profound that it made my chest ache. And what do you want? He asked softly. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I want this, I said, my voice trembling. I want you. But I'm scared, Ryan. I don't know how to do this. We'll figure it out, he said, his voice steady and reassuring. Together. For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of my confession settling between us. Then, Ryan leaned forward, his forehead resting against mine. You're not alone, he whispered. You don't have to do this alone. The tears I had been holding back spilled over, and I closed my eyes, letting the weight of his words wash over me. For the first time in years, I felt like I could let go of the guilt, the fear, the expectations. When I opened my eyes, Ryan was watching me, his expression open and unguarded. I'll follow your lead, he said softly. Whatever you decide, I'm here. That night, as we sat together on the couch, I realized that the answer to Ryan's question had been there all along. What I wanted wasn't just him. It was the freedom to live my life on my terms, to embrace the love that had been quietly growing between us, no matter how unconventional it might seem. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to find out. A week later, Ryan suggested we take a weekend trip, just the two of us. A fresh start, he called it, his eyes bright with hope. I hesitated at first, the weight of my doubts still lingering. But as I looked at him, at the steady reassurance in his gaze, I felt a flicker of courage. Okay, I said finally. His smile was immediate, and the way he pulled me into his arms made my heart feel lighter than it had in years. The day we left for the trip, I stood by the window, watching as Ryan loaded the car. The house was quiet behind me, but for the first time, the silence didn't feel oppressive. As I stepped outside, the sunlight warmed my skin, and I felt a sense of hope I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Ryan held the car door open for me, his smile soft but full of promise. Ready? He asked. I nodded, my chest tightening with both anticipation and a sense of possibility. Let's go, I said, stepping into the car and buckling my seatbelt. This time I didn't need him to fix it for me.